Hello, and welcome on behalf of the Oakwood Historical Society and the Mound Science and Energy Museum Association. My name is Lee Turbin, and I'm the president of the Oakwood Historical Society. And with me today, I have Bob Bowman, a board member for the Mound Museum Association and a former employee of the Mound Laboratory. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, today we have an amazing woman with us who's going to be telling you her story, Mrs. Betty Halley Jones. It's the story of a young girl who grew up during the Depression, was a teenager when World War II broke out, and as a young woman she worked on the secret and restricted Dayton Project during the development of our first atomic bomb. Please welcome Betty.
Thank you.
Betty, it is such a pleasure to have you here today. May I be so bold as to ask when you were born?
November 1924.
So next November, this lovely lady is going to be 95. It is such an honor to have you here today.
Thank you.
You know, I first met Betty at a presentation of the Far Hill Speaker Series. And I must tell you that when you first meet Betty with her smiling eyes, she's pretty hard to forget. She was a guest speaker for a presentation on polonium in the Playhouse, the story about the top secret mission to produce polonium in the unsuspecting setting of the Runnymede Playhouse. And that was all part of the Dayton Project. Bob, can you give us a little more information on that?
Yes, the Dayton Project was the work done by the Monsanto Chemical Company for the United States government as part of the much larger Manhattan Project. The purpose was to research and develop methods to extract and purify the highly radioactive polonium that was used to prepare a key component in the nuclear weapon. That is, it was used to make neutrons that would initiate the chemical chain reaction in the atomic bombs, thereby producing the bomb and, of course, changing history.
And that brings us back to Betty. Betty started with the Dayton Project in 1945. She started working in the electronics laboratory, but shortly they realized her talent and they moved her right along. During her career, Betty led several of the detonator programs for Monsanto and was actively involved in various technical and engineering activities until she retired in 1979. Quite an amazing career, Betty.
Thank you.
But let's go back to the beginning. You grew up during the Great Depression.
Yes.
What are your memories of that, and what impact did that have on you?
How much time do you have?
As much time as you want.
No, the thing I remember most, we lived in Piqua, and my father had just built us, well, about 4 years prior to 29, had built this new home for us, indoor plumbing and everything. But we lost that during the Depression, and that started a move to Dayton then, where there was more work to be done, or at least he hoped there would be. And then, of course, to find a place for the family to stay. Well, the place they found was Mother's pick.
Usually is, right?
Yes.
Moms usually win.
Well, the house wasn't all that great, but the grounds, there was a lot of grounds, and she saw that we could have a garden, have chickens, and maybe one of these days have a cow.
Ooh.
Well, my two brothers then were born there also before we moved to Dayton.
Okay. So you had two brothers?
Yes.
And a younger sister?
Yes, Kristen wasn't born until many years later. She was born 6 years after my younger brother.
Okay, so she was born in Dayton.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
1933.
What else do you remember about living in your home in Dayton?
Well, Daddy finally bartered for a cow.
Oh, good.
He was working for a man that had a farm, and he saw that there were cows in the farm. So he thought, this is a good deal. I'll get Mother and we'll go out and pick out a cow. So she did. She was a farmer girl,
Okay.
so she knew what she was doing, and that cow was wonderful. It gave us all the milk we wanted. Mother churned butter, and we had butter, and we had buttermilk, and we had ice cream. So we did very well.
Was food scarce?
Food was very scarce, yes. We ate what we could get from the garden. Mother did a lot of canning, and I can remember one winter day, she put the three of us around her and fed us one at a time.
So she took one spoonful to your brother, one to you, one to your other brother. Did she ever take any?
No, she never did.
Oh.
And that bothered me for a long time. But I also remember that at Christmas,
Yeah.
we only got an apple, each of us. But that was so good. I can remember it so well. But they had kept it outside, and it was nice and cold and juicy.
Aw.
But the other thing I remember so well is that she always made my clothes out of hand-me-downs, or this one particular dress that I liked so well was made out of silk. My father's boss always wore silk shirts, and he gave him a number of shirts one day, so Mother cut them all up, made me a dress, and it had a big, big skirt on it. And if I was sitting with the boys in church, if I was sitting in the middle, I'd always drape the skirt around across their laps. I remember that so well.
Oh, I can just see you with your skirt spread across your two brothers' laps.
Yeah.
What did they have to say about that?
They didn't say anything.
Oh, my goodness. And then let's see, in 1939, the war broke out. You were, what, 15 at that
Yes.
time? What do you recall from that period?
Mostly living under the rationing.
Oh,
The
yeah.
sugar was rationed, the gasoline was rationed. Ever so many things were, but those two really stand out in my mind.
What about extra grease? You were saying that you
Oh,
used
yes.
to collect it all?
Well,
That's
we
so
saved all the
interesting.
grease. We saved all the grease we could, and they had stations all around Dayton where you could take the grease and turn it in. So everybody was saving all the grease that they could from from anything that they,
Yeah.
particularly bacon, if they were able to get bacon.
You know, I heard about a campaign called Turning Bacon into Bombs.
Yes,
And they took that grease and they made explosives out of it.
that's right.
Which is pretty incredible. Well, did your brothers fight in the war?
Jerry, my older brother, joined as soon as he could. He lied about his age.
Oh, my.
And, yes, but went into, I think he was anxious to get, he was one of these kind that loved to hunt and fish and was ready for any kind of adventure he could find.
How old was he, if I can interrupt you?
Just 16,
16.
Yes.
Oh, my gosh.
yes. But the other brother then, the younger brother, didn't enlist until, well, he enlisted also. He quit school early and enlisted at 16.
Oh,
But,
my goodness.
They were both in. And
Yeah.
I often wondered if Mother ever really worried about them. And I asked her one day, and she says, well, there's no need to worry if you don't hear anything.
Yeah.
So
No news is good
she
news.
refused to let us know if she did.
Aw, gosh. Well, you know, during that time, there was an awful lot of propaganda for women, to encourage women to get out and go to work. They called them war jobs, recall that? And there were a lot of slogans like, the more women at work, the sooner we'll win, or even the negative appeal, a soldier may die if you don't do your part. I mean, were you influenced by these government campaigns?
Well, I guess I never really thought about too much about it. It was just one of those things you started seeing and seeing more and more and more. But it was on, they had it on the streetcars, signs around town, just about anywhere you looked. Sometimes they had it on the lights that go around buildings or whatever they're
Oh,
called.
my goodness.
And it was, you just did it.
Yep. And I think that's a recurring theme that we're going to hear throughout your interview today. So how then did you get involved in the war efforts? You were in high school.
Yes. Well, I really wanted to be a surgeon, but I had always had an interest in mechanical and surgical or mechanical things too. So I took a course at Parker Co-op, and I didn't know it was I didn't know it was Parker at the time. I didn't know it until many years later, really. But it was Patterson Air Force Base was giving the base
Okay.
the course, and I signed up for the radio and drafting, and the radio was very, very limited, just enough that we could crawl in the planes and see if the radios were transmitting or sending. So I'm sure it went on if I had stayed long enough, but during the drafting course, one day a man came in, talked with the instructor, and came back to me, and I never knew why this happened, but asked if I would come to work for him to a place called Jameson Electronics. His name was Russ Jameson.
Okay.
And I worked there then until he moved to Kansas City, and he wanted to take us with him, the other girl that was working like I was. And my father didn't want me to go, so I didn't go. I was Daddy's girl.
Oh. I remember you telling me a story about your father when you were working out at Patterson Base. You were working nights, correct? Yes. And it was hard, and you were standing on that cement floor all night long. Tell us about that.
Well, by morning, my legs were aching, my feet were hurting, my back was hurting. I just hurt all over. But when I left the building, Daddy was outside in a truck with some coffee for me.
And what advice did he have for you?
Well, he was very nice. He talked with me about it, and he says, don't worry about it right now. He says, when you get out in the workplace, you'll find bumps all along the way, but all you have to do is do your job as well as you can, and that's all that they can expect of you.
That was great advice.
Yes.
Great advice. Well, let's fast forward to 1945. Tell us about the interview that you had with Dr. Wilhelm Hyde, the Dayton Project's electronics section chief. This was pretty interesting.
This was quite an experience, too. Mother, one Saturday, Mother asked me to go with her for an interview that she had read about in the paper, or to sign up for a job. So I went, and while we were there, we were introduced. Well, the guard first took us to a little room and told us that a man would be down shortly, or somebody would be down shortly. So Dr. Hyde came in, introduced himself, and started talking with Mother. But very soon he turned over to me and asked me what I was doing, and I told him what I had done at Jameson Electronics. And I had also, after Jameson left town, I went to Univis Lens. But I told him all of these, that I had ground radio frequency crystals for the boys in the field, and also crystals for the highway patrol at that time. They used crystals also. And at Univis Lens, and I inspected the prisms for telescopes that were in the submarines. But that, for some reason, triggered something, and he got up, looked down at me, and he says, I want you to be here Monday morning and start working for us. And I said, I can't, I've got a job. And he said, don't worry about Univis Lens, we'll take care of that. You just be here Monday morning.
Oh my goodness.
So I went Monday morning.
Well, what did your mother think about this? Because this was an interview that she had set up for herself.
Well, she looked at me and I looked at her, and she says, what in the world happened?
Well,
and I don't know.
I believe on your screen there's a picture of Betty, and I've got to say, I don't fault Dr. Hyde. I mean, she was a real beauty. And I know you can't tell from the picture, but she had red hair and green eyes, so beauty and brains all in one package. Alrighty, so you were hired to come to work for the Dayton Project. What was your first day like?
That again was rather startling. The first thing he did was, of course, pick me up from this little room the guard had put us in the first place, escorted me up to a room where a man was standing, and the man just automatically, I guess, asked me what size shoes I wore, gave me 2 pair of shoes, 2 pair of socks, and 2 uniforms, pants and top. And Joe took me then on down around and showed me his office, which was attached really to the room that they were working in. But there was 2 young gentlemen in there named Will Conacher and Bob Gunther Moore. And they were from the spatial units of the Army. But they were beautiful young people.
What was it called? The rooms? Were they counting
Oh,
rooms?
no, we were building the counters for the counting room.
Okay. And what were you
And
counting?
They were counting the activity that was on samples given to them from the chemists as they were processing polonium.
Okay, so you were building the machinery to read those
Yes,
that radioactivity.
yes.
Okay, now you had mentioned the GIs that were working in the Dayton Project. Tell me a little bit more about them.
Well, they were very interesting in that at that time, it was not supposed to be known that we had GIs working there. So they only wore civilian clothes. But when they had to go out to the base for some reason or other, they changed clothes in the bus on the way out and then changed back
Oh my goodness.
on the way back home so that any of the neighbors couldn't tell that they had uniforms.
Goodness.
But there were about 40 of these people throughout both complex, Unit 3 and Unit 4, which was a Runnymede Playhouse. So they were all just spatial people that the Army had trained specifically for this kind of work.
Tell me about one of them was stopped by a police officer.
Oh, yes. Will Conacher, just one of the 2 that I worked with, came in red-faced one morning, and Bob asked him what was the matter, because he was late, and he had been stopped by a police officer the night before. He was driving and couldn't show him his identification papers for obvious reasons. So they put him in isolation until they could get a hold of his supervisor and come in and vouch for him.
Oh my goodness, that's funny. Now, Bob, you referred to these GIs as SEDs.
Yes, what that stood for, these men were members of a special engineering detachment in the U.S. Army. And they had been specifically selected after they had been enlisted or drafted based upon their combination of their educational background and aptitude tests for assignment as technicians or engineering specialists. And after technical training at military posts or at selected colleges such as the City University of New York, they were sent to locations directly supporting the Manhattan Project or other secret high-priority projects. All these GIs had top-level secret clearances. Now, Betty, when you began working at the Bone Break Seminary, there had been converted into a laboratory. But there were other buildings involved in the Dayton Project, including the Runnymede Playhouse, which was chosen as an unsuspecting place to chemically separate and purify the radioactive polonium starting in 1944. Now,
We're going to put a map up. I think, yes, on your screen you see a map of the Dayton Project.
Yes, and as you see in the map, that the Monsanto company was actually located on Nicholas Road, and that was designated as Unit 1. And that was where they started the project, but they quickly discovered they needed more space. And what they did is they found another facility at the Bone Break Seminary up north, which became Unit 3.
Great.
And they were using that project for part of it. And then they found out they needed even additional space. And in order to do that, using the connection that the director of Charles Thomas had, they took the Runnymede Playhouse from the Talbot family in Oakwood. And that was then taken over and rented from the Talbot family and became Unit 4. And that was the primary area for processing the polonium and for producing the material for separating it. And by 1945, they used an additional facility called the warehouse on East 3rd Street. That picture right there, and that was used primarily for storage, but also the health physics monitoring equipment was up there, and they would do testing of the central location for doing that. And so all those locations are shown on the map. Monsanto had another location south of town called Unit 2, which is off 741 near where the Dayton Mall is now, and that was used for an entirely different project of processing rocket fuel testing, not part of the Dayton project. Yes. But so you hear the Unit 1, 3, and 4 as being part of the Dayton project.
Right.
And Betty, where did you work?
I worked here at Bone Break,
Oh,
the
Bone
old
Break,
seminary.
okay.
And we used to walk to Unit 1, or not walk, they were driven over to Unit 1 for lunch. But we walked many times. If the
Did
bus
you?
wasn't there, we'd start back.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we made it back before the bus
Before
started.
the bus came. Well, very briefly, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Runnymede Playhouse. It was originally built in 1927 by Catherine Talbot. She was the wife of Oakwood's first mayor, Harold Talbot. So they built this beautiful, elegant concert hall, and it was used for many gala events. And even after their death, it was used for many social functions like dances and graduations and music recitals. In fact, Dr. Charles Allen Thomas, who was the director of the Dayton Project, was married at the Runnymede Playhouse. He married Margaret Stoddard Talbot, and so obviously his connections to the Runnymede Playhouse ran quite deep, and it's no surprise that he then chose that location for the production of the polonium. Now, Betty, I know you didn't work at the Runnymede Playhouse, but what are your recollections of it?
Well, my first recollections was that I guess I back up just a little bit. When Dr. Hyde had meetings at the Playhouse for one reason or another, he didn't drive, so he asked me.
He didn't drive.
He didn't drive.
Oh. Okay.
But he asked me then if I would get the keys to the company car and take him over. So while he was tending to business in the Playhouse, I just sit around the elegant pool and relax, and I thought, boy, I've got it made these days.
Oh, I know it was in a suburb of Oakwood.
Yes.
Was it hard to keep secret what was going on at the Playhouse?
Well, Oakwood is an upper class neighborhood, and the people there were not liking trucks coming in and out, but they didn't know what they were for to begin with.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, the nosy neighbors, they wanted to know what was going on over there. So they had to change the schedule for the buses, or the trucks rather, to come in late at night.
Okay.
So that they wouldn't disturb the neighbors, hopefully.
Interesting, interesting. Now, Bob, that's where the purification process was taking place, correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little about that?
Certainly. The extraction and purification of the polonium metal by by the Dayton Project was really a very complex chemical process, and it required handling a large amount of the initial radioactive materials in order to get this particular element collected. And there were two primary sources of getting the polonium. The first one was the very inefficient process of extracting from ore, lead-based ore, the polonium, and they actually were able to only extract about 10 milligrams of polonium out of 37 tons of the lead oxide rocks. And that was 10 milligram was just barely enough to make a single device. So the other alternative, which was developed during the war, was a separate way to make polonium, which was from neutron irradiation of bismuth metal, another metal, and that work was done initially at the Oak Ridge facility and later at the Hanford place developed during the Manhattan Project. And then that material was sent into Dayton, and they were then able to extract much larger quantities of the polonium from this neutron irradiated bismuth metal. So much that by the late spring of 1945, they were sending around 8.4 milligrams per week of the polonium to Los Alamos, where the initiator devices were actually fabricated for the first atomic bomb that was exploded in Trinity and the two bombs that were used on Japan.
Interesting.
So now, of course, the polonium is a very hazardous and radioactive material. And now, Betty, did you realize that your work was dangerous or potentially dangerous?
I didn't realize it at the time. None of us really knew that much about it well, we were suspicious about it, but we didn't know how much damage it could do to you. But I had been working on, we built our own Geiger counters too, which were handheld Geiger counters that they would use to check doors or doorknobs and that sort of thing. But that was the only time that I was really aware of contamination. Of course, at that time, you didn't know very much about what was going on in the other room. And that was, if you didn't have reason to be in this room, you stayed out of it. So, a lot of things went on that I didn't know about.
There were actually a lot of precautions taken to keep the information controlled and secret. Do you recall some of the things that were being done to?
Well, along with meetings all the time about what you see here, keep here, there were also signs on streetcars and radios like loose slips, sink ships. Yeah. And of course I mentioned that we were not allowed to go into rooms we weren't assigned to, but the secrecy was always maintained very, very strictly. And as far as I know, I don't think anything was leaked, except we did have a Russian spy in our group, but we only found that out like many, many years later. And it was in his obituary that he was from Russia, and Russia had the obituary that it was told that he worked at the Dayton Project, and we pinpointed him then at Unit 3.
Yes, yeah. His name was George Koval.
Yes.
So, did you know George?
I never worked with him, and I didn't know him except that if I had a Geiger counter that maybe had too much contamination on it, I would save it or put it back, and he'd pick it up and take it to health physics and decontaminate it and bring it back. But that's the only time I had any contact with him.
Yes, his story is quite interesting. His code name as a Soviet spy was Delmar, and he was actually born in the United States to Russian parents and grew up in Iowa. What was unknown to you and everyone else during the war was that he had returned to the Soviet Union in the 1930s and had come back into the United States, particularly as a spy in the late 1940. And then after he was drafted in 1943, because of his education and skills, he was assigned to the SED unit, and went to the Manhattan Project, first in Tennessee, and then to the Dayton Project, where he arrived in the spring of 1945 and worked until he was discharged in February 1946. So he was a very competent individual, and apparently very personable too.
He was in a health physics position. Can you tell us briefly what that is and why that was a good position for him?
Yes, because the health physics people were monitoring the radioactivity, and therefore they had a lot broader access to things there, so he could see for himself. And what people didn't know is that he already had a degree from Soviet Union in chemical technology, so he could easily understand and apparently conveyed that information to him.
Interesting. Now, I know you studied him. How many years do you think that he accelerated the nuclear bomb for Russia?
Well, it's difficult to say precisely because the Soviets also had other spies within the country that provided information. However, it's estimated that it's at least 2 years advantage, and perhaps as many as 4 or 5 or more in advance to have their first explosion, first detonation. But the thing is that Koval was, after he died in 2006, was made a hero of the Russian Federation by Vladimir Putin, and it explicitly identified him for his contributions during the Manhattan Project. So his information apparently was critical to the development of the Soviet atomic bomb.
And that's when we found out about it.
And that's pretty much at least we, the public, knew. I'm certain that the government had an idea. Koval never returned to the United States after he left after World War II.
Interesting, interesting. Well, Betty, when you first started working at the Dayton Project, you were one of 2 technical women. Mm-hmm. I guess it was Mary Lou Curtis. She was in charge of the 2 counting rooms. Yes. I mean, what was it like being a young woman working in a field that was predominantly dominated by men?
You know, at that time, I guess we never really thought about it because just about all the women that needed to work at all were working in some kind of war capacity.
Okay.
So it was just, you know, the men were gone, women had to start doing something.
Right.
So we did what we were given a job and we did it.
Did you ever experience any harassment or prejudice?
No, I really can't say that I ever did.
No. You had once said to me that they treated you more like a sister.
Yes.
And
yes.
what happened after your father passed away?
Well, when Daddy died, Daddy was killed on the job.
Oh. And I think they all came to your home, didn't they?
They did.
That's quite a family there. It really is. Well, tell us, if you can, about August 5th, 1945, when we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. I know they showed a video to you and your coworkers, correct?
Yes.
What was your reaction, and did you and your coworkers realize what role you played in that?
Well, I don't know how much the chemists knew, but we didn't know anything.
Really?
And when they showed the picture and then told us that we had been a part of that, one of the chemists, and evidently didn't know either, just simply got up and left the project. He didn't want any more to do with it.
Really?
Yes, the pictures were pretty graphic.
Were they?
Yes, yes. So
I'm
we
sure.
were never told about any of the testing prior to that at White Sands in New Mexico. We were never told about, well, the dropping of Hiroshima
Right.
until they showed the picture.
Right.
But
Well, I think you had mentioned that, you know, your work took on greater respect and after that moment because you realized what part you played in that.
yes, that's true. We really did. I think everybody was pretty sober for a couple days.
Really?
They were trying to absorb all this.
Well, I know you worked hard, obviously, but were there some fun times too?
Oh my, yes.
Well, good. Why don't you tell us about some of them?
Yeah, well, you know, I didn't start until May, and they dropped the bomb in
August.
August,
Yes.
yes. I started to say August, and I thought, come on.
No.
But,
You're good. You got it.
but anyway, during that time, you know, it was nice and sunny out, but we went to Coney Island, which is upriver from Cincinnati, a group of us, and then we'd go. There were two families that were renting a home in Oakwood on Harmon Avenue, west of Far Hills.
Okay.
Big house, and we'd go there for picnics very often, and then on the third floor of that house, they had a ballroom, and we'd go up there and have sing-alongs, and somebody play the piano or whatever, and it was
Wow.
just great fun.
Well, good. So,
That
Bob,
one thing at the I'm sorry.
No,
One
go
thing
ahead.
at the playhouse or at this house, and I had heard of it. I didn't really see it because we didn't go into the living quarters of the people that were living there. But the fireplace, I was told a person could stand up in it. It was that big.
Oh my gosh. Have you ever gone back and tried to find that home on Harmon?
I have, and you know I can't find it.
Really?
No.
Well, we'll have to take a field trip, you and me, okay?
Yes, I don't know where
We'll
it
have to
is.
find that.
After the war ended in 1945, your work with Monsanto continued. The Dayton project, the United States was still working on developing the atomic weapons. And tell about the transition that occurred from the Dayton project that was scattered in those various locations. And when they went to the new Mound laboratory that was being built in Miamisburg. And you had a role in that as well.
Yes, Joe Hyde had me in his office with a drafting board, and I made the drawings for the counting room that was in the T building. That it was a copper line building or lead line building, room for the counting room. But along with that, then they transitioned to the Atomic Energy Commission from the Manhattan Project in 47, 48, in that time frame, and most of the units then moved to Mound.
Right.
Unit 3 was the first to go. Unit 4, the Runnymede Playhouse group, were the last ones to move, and they went into the underground building that was T building.
Okay.
And that building was restricted. If you didn't have a badge to go there, to go down there, you couldn't go in the building. That was for a couple of years that they did that.
Yes, we have a map on the screen of the new Mound Laboratory. It was built on top of a hill, and there was a large number of buildings, and they're identified with letters like A is for administration, B is biology, which was originally they were doing biological tests on animals of radiation effect. But that program faded, but it was, I understand, converted to a detonator fabrication eventually.
Yes.
And there were buildings like Bronick's building and an I building for making explosives, and a machine shop in our building. And the T building you talk about, T is for technical, which was buried underground and specifically for processing the polonium. It was all that was concentrated right in there. But there was also a test fire where they would do a test for the detonation. So now you worked in primarily in what buildings?
In E building.
In E building, electronics
for
building.
electronics, okay.
Yes, and until 1955. And they then sent me to Los Alamos to learn all I could about detonators. And I was there for a period of time, 6 to 7 weeks. I was scheduled there. But I was supposed to concentrate mostly on the bridge wire assembly, which was very, very critical to the timing of the detonation of the bomb. And
And then what building were you working in then?
In B building. By then,
Okay.
biology had
Gotcha.
left, so they changed it or cleaned it out real good, and we came back and started training in B building.
Gotcha.
So going back to the new mound facility that was being built there, were the people in Miamisburg then understanding what was being done at Mound?
No, and they were pretty on edge, to be real honest with you. They'd see all these trucks going up and not knowing what they were doing, and you know, nobody would tell them what it was going to be. So when we moved down there, they had a technical program, science fair, that at the schoolhouse, and they invited all of Miamisburg to come to that, and it was very well attended. And then a couple days later, they put on a minstrel show.
Right. And I understand there were can girls.
And in fact, we have a photograph, I believe,
We do.
that shows the.
It's on the screen, Betty, but can you tell us which where you are on there?
This one,
Yep, fourth from the right.
Fourth one there. There she is. Part of
they
the.
were there.
So everyone played a part, right?
Yes,
Interesting.
everybody that was able to go down there
Yes.
played a part in it. Yes.
Yes, it was quite an event. Now, so for the next few years, Mound was very busy making the parts, polonium, but by 1953, as the things had changed and other technology is actually being developed, and what Mound was doing was being obsolete. And so things were pretty difficult at that time.
Yes,
right?
they were. And that was late 54 and 55 when they started laying people off. And let's see, in 55, in September of 55, they were down to just right around 100 people left on the whole hill. They were that bad. But then Dr. Hyde had been, and this was not known to anybody, but he had been talking with Los Alamos and found out that they were having a high reject rate with their soldering of the bridge wire. And this was done by Native American women, the Indians that were, well, they were from a pueblo down below the hill, just as you start up the mountain. They were from that pueblo, the San Ildefonso pueblo. But he offered then Mound to take over this work and that we would give them high quality detonators. So they took him up on it, thank goodness.
And that led for a special trip for you to New Mexico, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Yes, at that time, at that particular time, we were doing a very small job for Livermore, California. And I was sealing the caps on to containers of lithium to send, so that they wouldn't leak, to send those to Livermore. But while I was doing it, and this was all in a very hot room, in a glove box, and I couldn't take my hands out of the glove box, but Jack Tullis, who was the head of that program at the time, came around and would wipe my head with a cloth to keep the sweat from running in my eyes.
Goodness.
But it was during that time then that Jack came to me and said Lloyd Nagy wanted to see me up in his office right away. So I got ready to go up and I thought, oh boy, this is my time to go now. But he surprised me. He said, how much vacation, have you taken your vacation yet? And I said, no, I have not. And he said, well, we want you to take your vacation right away, starting right now. And in 2 weeks, I want you to meet me at the airport in Albuquerque. And I did, that's what we did.
So how did you get out to New Mexico? Did you drive?
Mother and I, with a friend, drove to, well, while we were going out west, at that time, we didn't even think about going up to Los Alamos. But when we got to Albuquerque, Mother said, I'd sure like to see where you're going to spend the next month and a half or so. So we made the trip from Albuquerque up through Santa Fe and up into Los Alamos. But we got halfway up the mountain and were stopped by a guard and said, if you don't have a badge to go any farther, you can't go any farther. You'll have to turn around and go back.
Right. Have you been there, Bob?
Yes, I have. I've been there off and on for a number of times. And you, if you haven't been to Los Alamos, it's on top of a mesa, surrounded. And so that gave them very limited control. That's one of the reasons why they chose that location during the Manhattan Project, was they could control it. Yeah. And so you would limit that. And that was the way it was done for a decade after that. So, but Betty, after you were turned away on your personal visit, you continued your trip.
Yes, we did.
Yes.
Well, we had time. You know, the 2 weeks wasn't up yet, so we went on out to California and came back and met Lloyd at the airport, and Mother and this friend flew back home and left the car with me, which was very generous of Mother. But so Lloyd and I then, on the way up to Los Alamos, he explained what my job would be, that I was to learn all I could about detonators, and particularly concentrate on the bridge wire assembly. Right. And then when I got home was to set up the labs and start training people as their clearances came in. So that's what I did.
Yep. Yep. And they called it the War Reserve, correct? Because you've referred to it as WR when we would talk, but
well,
they did refer to it as that, correct?
Yes, it didn't go WR until we sold our first lot.
Ah, okay.
Up to that time, it just, like the WR detonator that I was working on was the 2427, but before we sold the lot, it was a 1E26. It was just a learning, I guess, detonator.
Okay. So in other words, you brought back the information then to the mound. That was a super intensive program for you, wasn't it?
Oh my dear, yes. We worked, as the people came in, we saw that we were overcrowded, we're getting overcrowded, so they started 2 shifts. The molding shop molded the header, and of course the solders and all the inspectors that went along with it. But also they started training over in the explosive part, unloading the explosives onto making the pellets and loading them onto the header. So that went on, let's see, that program went on for about 2 years, and it was so intense that we worked through New Year's and Christmas.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, no break at all. So, but we got our, yes, we were able to get our first delivery in early 48, 58, yep. I'm sorry, yes. And that's when it went WR.
Okay.
We had it made then.
And actually this program that you were involved with really did help save the Mound Laboratories from existence, because the fabrication of these explosive components were really critical in the sense that now this was a stable mission that Mound could do. And for the next nearly 40 years, the explosive components and the evolution of those to weapon system was a major role. As much as 50 to 60% of the budget and the people were assigned to those departments for those projects. There were other things. There was a space program, and there was tritium work and other, but this was a main core and function for the Mound Laboratory.
Yeah, it kept Mound afloat.
It did, and so your role in helping to transition to teach that really was a critical one, and quite an accomplishment for you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. It was fun.
Absolutely. That was an accomplishment. And so during this time, you did a lot of traveling, didn't you?
Well, not until 1955. Well,
okay.
Of course, that was when I went to Los Alamos. Then in '61, by then I had asked to get out of. I didn't enjoy supervision, so I asked, after we sold our reserve lot, I asked to go back to development.
Okay.
And then in '61, they sent me to Los Alamos again. They were having trouble bending and cutting MDF, which went into the it's a mild detonator fuse. It's a lead shield with P10 on the inside of it. And the lead, of course, would smear across the P10 as they cut it. And that, they couldn't stand that. It had to be clear. So we worked on that a couple weeks and got it to where we thought it was fine. And I brought it back to Mound then. And the timer, that's what started the timer program.
Did you always have an escort when you traveled?
In 1961, I did not.
Oh,
Up until,
okay.
I mean, all the other times I've ever traveled, I did. They did
I
send
think
an
I
ex-
remember you telling me
Yes,
about this.
but in '61, when I was scheduled to go out, the planes were striking. I think it was a pilot strike. And they had to real quick get me reservations on the train. And I had a cabin, and I didn't leave that cabin from the time we left the station in Chicago till we got to Los Alamos. I was so afraid somebody would ask me something that I didn't know what I didn't want
or
to
couldn't say, right?
Yes.
I know. It kind of sounds like a mystery novel. You know, you're in your
was-
little cabin in the
It
train
was a
and
mystery.
Never poked your head out. Well, tell me, did you ever meet Dr. Oppenheimer, the director of the Manhattan Project?
The only time I ever met him was when the first day that all of us, by the way, there were 8 other men,
Right.
well, 9 total with Lloyd and me at Los Alamos. But when we all got together in the morning after breakfast and went out to the site, we were directed up to the man that was running the detonator program. I can't recall his name right offhand, but Dr. Oppenheimer was just there with his ever-present cigarette in his mouth. And of course we were introduced to him, but he didn't mean anything to us at the time.
Yeah.
But the man whose office we were in said, well, we have to initiate you to this Western culture. So he passed around a jar and he says, I want everybody to take one of these out of the jar and eat it. Well, they were the hottest peppers you ever could stand. I'll tell you, tears ran down my face and I started choking, but I wasn't the only one. There were others too that were doing the same thing. But that was our introduction to
exactly. Well, you were in New Mexico, right?
That's right.
Oh, I had to laugh. When I was talking to Betty about Dr. Oppenheimer, I said, you know, what about his smoking? And the one thing she said is, she said he would only take a cigarette out of his mouth long enough to put another one in. So, and sadly, I do have to report that Dr. Oppenheimer did die a very early death from throat cancer. Also on Dr. Oppenheimer, there was a little controversy. Did you ever hear any of the rumors associating him with the Communist Party? I mean, this was the time of McCarthyism. And
yes. No, I really didn't. People just didn't talk in those days. And the only time that I knew that he had communist vows or leanings was mostly his wife. But I read that in Portrait of an Enigma when I was reading up on Dr. Oppenheimer.
Interesting, interesting.
Now, you continue your career. As you said, you went back to research and development after the transition. And part of that is you were working on the development of detonators. And we have a schematic of the detonator that you were working on. Could you kind of give us a description of what it entailed to fabricate these devices? And
well, the first thing they were the headers. We made the headers at Mound, molded the headers with the electrodes in them, and then, well, you can't really see it very well, but there's 2 little things here with a wire in between them, and those were the most critical part of the detonator. That was the bridge wire that I was training people for. But then when we finished that and all the inspections were finished, this unit or this header with the bridge wire was sent over to the high explosives area, and they would put on a disc that Mound molded, a tetral disc on both sides, and then they would load PET directly in onto the bridge wire, and then cap the whole thing with a PET pellet. That was
Sounds complicated.
And that really was like the first generation, and they continued to work on that. Now, there's a story of a quality control engineer named Frank Jones who came to Mound, and he worked with you.
Yes, Frank was there 1 or 2 years, I don't know what it was, before we really started working together. But one of his first jobs when he came, Sandia by that time had wanted us to begin with. The firing characteristics at test fire were all done by hand, the mathematical part of it. So they were slow in getting the results, and they wanted Frank then to take on the responsibility of putting in a program, a computer program, to see what, or to get faster speed and results on the timing.
Okay.
So Frank took a course, a crash course at University of Dayton in Fortran 4, and when he came back then, they put me with him to work with him any way that we could. So we of course, at that time, you punched cards, and they were sent them through a reader, and you'd get the reading back and try to debug it if there was anything wrong with it. And that's what he taught me enough that I could work with him on that.
Yeah. Well, before we leave detonators, didn't you make quite an enhancement to the bridge wire?
No, the work I did at that time was for Livermore, and they were working on a different type detonator. So we were varying the bridge wire lengths and sizes. The normal bridge wire, or the bridge wire in the WR lot, was 1.5 mils in diameter, which is finer than your hair. But and it had very critical, of course, measurements along with it, or tolerances. But the ones for Livermore, we were varying the width of the electrode and the diameter of the wires, and we also tried silver along with gold. But they went back to the old
gold.
stand by our gold.
Okay.
So, with all your work, what did you feel were some of your biggest accomplishments while you were at Mound?
Well, I guess the initial training and certification process needed to get the War Reserve detonators into production.
Right.
And by the time I left in '79 then, I had been given the engineer's title, which I felt was a real accomplishment. But I had been assigned to work directly with the engineers at Sandia and take over the WR program.
Yeah, you really ought to be congratulated. I mean, you've had a long, productive career that did many things with a lot of technology. But I did want to ask, were you ever exposed in the time that you were and with Monsanto to radioactivity during your time either at the Dayton Project or at Mound?
One time at Unit 3, I had gone into the chemist room where they were working, and as I just inside the door to pick up a counter, and as I was leaving, I heard a crash, and of course they pulled me real quick out. Everybody was scattering to get outside, and they cleaned us up. They made us wash in lava soap and rinse off with Clorox. But that's the only time that I was really till I really got it. And I doubt if I got much exposure at
Right.
all.
I mean, she's going to be 95,
So she did all right.
maybe we could all use a dose of it.
But again, you're with the detonators, we're non-radioactive.
Yes.
And while they are explosives, it was small quantities and so forth. And you weren't responsible for the testing of them. You were responsible for fabrication.
Well, only after Frank had gotten this program going in test fire, and then of course we were anxious to see what it was doing. And in order to certify a lot, we had to test fire 28 detonators, and they had to fire simultaneously, and that's what the program was to do, was to make sure that they are, to see that the spontaneity was good in all of them.
There is another incident you had mentioned before that took place, and that was fairly late in your career, and that had to involve a trip out to Pantex in Texas.
Oh my, yes, that was another one. This was in 71 or 72, something like that. I'm not sure when it was now. My mind's slipping. But they told me I was to go to Pantex at Amarillo, Texas, and change a detonator on a live bomb. So they sent Frank along because he was a quality control engineer on the project as an escort, and also, I guess, to make sure that I was doing it right. But we got there, and I felt miserable on that trip because I think I had the flu. But nevertheless, the next morning when we met to go to work, we drove out to the base.
This was in the desert, right?
Yes, out in the desert.
Okay.
But they escorted us then to an automobile, or a van rather, where 4 of the men were sitting, and that van then took us many miles out into the desert to a Quonset hut that had a covering, of course, just a little mountain of sand over the top of it. But there was a guard standing on the outside when we got there, and before we went in, he took all our badges and left. And so we went inside, and there was another person in there that explained what we were going to do, or what I was supposed to do, and showed me the detonator that needed to be changed. So I took the cable off it. By the way, there were 28 detonators that are on the bomb, and they're all wired, this cable wire. It's all one with leads all around. So I took the cable off the detonator, replaced the detonator, put the cable back on, and left. And when we got out then, they gave us our badges again, and they said the reason they took the badges when it was in case anything blew, they'd know who was in there.
Goodness. So the live nuclear warhead was successfully repaired.
Yes,
And your badges, and you all returned home safely.
we returned home safely.
What a great story. And then I understand that a year later, you and Frank were married. Remember
Yes.
Frank Jones, the quality control engineer? And you've been married, 44 years now?
Yes.
So you're to be congratulated on that. And I understand that Frank, prior to his work at Monsanto, was a B-17 pilot in World War II. Wow, that would be another fascinating story. Well, after 34 years of working on top secret and dangerous projects, you retired in 1979. Betty, you've certainly had an amazing life and career, and we're so fortunate to have you here today. In closing, what advice can you give us?
I guess the same advice my father gave me way back when you're given a job, do it to the best of your ability. You'll find bumps along the way, but you can handle it.
Well, thank you so very much for sharing your story. And a special thanks to Bob Bowman from the Mound Museum Association, and on behalf of the Oakwood Historical Society and the Mound Museum Association, we hope you've enjoyed the program and meeting the lovely and accomplished Betty Halley Jones.